I am Matthew Wilson, 35 years old, and I never thought I would have to take my own family to court. After working hard for 12 years as a software engineer, I finally bought my dream house in a peaceful suburb. Then my parents showed up with my unemployed brother Jason and all his belongings, saying it was just temporary. 3 months later, they were demanding I financially support him indefinitely. What happened next in that courtroom changed everything forever. If you are watching this right now, let me know where you are viewing from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe to hear how I stood up against family exploitation and reclaimed my life and my home. I grew up in a modest middle-class family in Riverdale, a small town in Ohio where everyone knew each other. My childhood home was nothing fancy, a 3-bedroom house with faded blue siding that my father Robert was always promising to replace. My mother Linda worked as an elementary school secretary, while my father held a steady job at the local manufacturing plant. We were comfortable, not wealthy, but my parents always emphasized the importance of education as the path to a better life. From an early age, I was the responsible one. I maintained good grades, worked summer jobs, and saved whatever money I could. My younger brother Jason, on the other hand, was different. 3 years younger than me, Jason was the charming one, able to talk his way out of almost any situation. When I would get grounded for missing curfew, Jason would somehow negotiate his way to a lesser punishment for the same offense. This pattern continued throughout our childhood. College was my ticket out of Riverdale. I worked incredibly hard to get a partial scholarship to State University, majoring in computer science. Even with the scholarship, I had to take out substantial student loans and work 20 hours a week at the campus IT help desk to make ends meet. Those 4 years were a blur of classes work, instant noodles, and very little sleep. But I graduated with honors and landed an entry-level position at Tech Solutions in Chicago. My first apartment was a tiny studio with barely enough room for a bed and desk. I lived frugally, putting every spare dollar toward paying off my student loans. Meanwhile, Jason had dropped out of community college after 1 semester, claiming it was a waste of time. He cycled through a series of retail and restaurant jobs, never staying anywhere longer than 6 months. When he got fired from the local electronics store for repeatedly showing up late, my parents paid his rent until he found another job. When he crashed his car and had no insurance, they bought him a used Honda. Over the next decade, I climbed the career ladder steadily. I moved from Tech Solutions to a mid-sized tech firm, then to WebCore, a major software company where I eventually became a senior developer. My salary increased with each move, and 3 years ago, at 32, I achieved my dream of buying my own house. It was a beautiful 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom home in Oak Ridge, an upscale suburb with excellent schools and tree-lined streets. I spent weekends painting walls, installing new fixtures, and making it truly mine. I even converted 1 bedroom into a home office where I could work on side projects. Throughout this time, my relationship with my family remained steady but distant. I would visit Riverdale for major holidays and call my parents every Sunday. Jason, meanwhile, continued his pattern of instability. He would excitedly call about a new job opportunity, only to quit a month later because his manager was out to get him or the work was beneath his skills. Despite never completing his degree, Jason believed he deserved a high-paying position right away. I tried to help him several times. When WebCore had an opening in customer support, I put in a good word for Jason. He got the interview but showed up 20 minutes late and underdressed. Another time, I spent hours helping him create a professional resume and setting up profiles on job sites. He never followed through with applications. I offered to pay for him to take coding classes, thinking he might follow my path, but he attended 2 sessions before deciding it was too difficult. My parents continued to enable his behavior. They would complain about Jason's irresponsibility when talking to me, but never enforced consequences. When he lived with them briefly after another job loss, they did his laundry, cooked his meals, and gave him spending money while he played video games all day. I expressed my concerns that they were hindering his growth, but they would become defensive. You do not understand, Matthew. Jason is different. He needs more support. Last February, the call came that would change everything. It was a cold Tuesday evening, and I had just finished a demanding day leading a team meeting for a critical project. My phone rang as I was preparing dinner. Matthew, we need to talk about Jason, my mother said, her voice tight with worry. He lost his job at the warehouse. The company downsized and he was one of the first let go because he had only been there for 2 months. I sighed, stirring the pasta on my stove. That is unfortunate, but he will find something else. There is more, she continued. His landlord is not renewing his lease. The building is being converted to condos and everyone has to be out by the end of the month. That is only 2 weeks away, I noted. What is his plan? There was a pause and I could hear my father's voice in the background. Well, my mother said slowly, we were hoping he could stay with you. Just for a few weeks until he finds a new job and gets back on his feet. I felt a knot forming in my stomach. Mom, I do not think that is a good idea. My place is not that big and I need my home office for work. Please, Matthew, she pleaded. He has nowhere else to go. We would take him in, but we are in the middle of renovating the bathroom and the house is torn apart. It would just be temporary, I promise. After 20 minutes of back and forth with both parents taking turns on the phone to convince me, I reluctantly agreed. Fine. He can stay in the guest room for a few weeks, but I need him to actively look for work and contribute to groceries once he has an income. Of course, my father assured me. He just needs a little help right now. You will hardly know he is there. I spent the next few days preparing the guest room, cleaning out the closet to make space and buying extra toiletries. I created a set of house rules including quiet hours since I often had early morning meetings, expectations about shared spaces and guidelines about guests. I even researched local job openings that might suit Jason's experience. Despite my misgivings, part of me hoped this might be a chance to strengthen our relationship as adults. Looking back, I was naive about what was about to unfold in my carefully built life. The following Saturday, my parents arrived with Jason in their aging SUV. I had expected 1, maybe 2 suitcases. Instead, I watched in growing dismay as they unloaded box after box, bag after bag. Jason carried in a large television gaming console and collection of sports memorabilia. My father struggled with a heavy dresser that clearly would not fit in the guest room. What is all this? I asked, blocking the doorway as my brother attempted to bring in what appeared to be a small bookshelf. Just the essentials, Jason replied with a shrug. His casual tone matched his appearance, unshaven, wearing a wrinkled t-shirt and basketball shorts despite the February chill. He looked nothing like someone who had just experienced a major life setback and needed temporary assistance. My mother bustled past me carrying a box labeled winter clothes. Jason needs his things, Matthew. We could not possibly store all this at our house with the renovation. But this looks like everything you own, I said, turning to Jason. Not everything, he said, with a half smile. I left my summer stuff at Mom and Dad's. That evening I cooked dinner for everyone, grilled chicken, roasted vegetables, and rice. I had hoped for a chance to discuss expectations and timelines over a nice meal. Instead, the conversation centered around my parents reminiscing about our childhood and Jason complaining about his former boss. The guy had it out for me from day one, Jason said, helping himself to a 3rd serving of food. I was faster than most of the other workers, but he would always find something to criticize. Have you started looking for new positions? I asked, attempting to steer the conversation in a productive direction. Jason waved dismissively. I am going to take a week to decompress. That place was toxic. My parents nodded sympathetically. He deserves a little break, my mother said, patting his hand. When they finally left that evening, after helping Jason arrange his excessive belongings in and around the guest room, my father pulled me aside at the door. Thank you for doing this, son. Family helps family. It will just be for a little while. I nodded, already feeling a sense of foreboding. That first week confirmed my worst fears. Jason slept until past noon every day while I worked from my home office. When he finally emerged, he would make an elaborate breakfast, leaving the kitchen cluttered with dishes and food scraps. Despite my polite reminders about cleaning up, the messes remained until I eventually cleaned them myself to avoid attracting bugs. In the evenings, he would monopolize the living room television, playing video games at high volume even when I mentioned I had early meetings the next day. Empty snack bags and soda cans accumulated around the couch. When I asked about his job search, he would provide vague responses about checking some leads or waiting to hear back from contacts. By Friday, I was at my breaking point. I called my best friend Alex during my lunch break, stepping outside to the backyard for privacy. "It is not working out," I told him, pacing across the lawn. "He treats my house like a hotel, except with no respect for the property or other guests." "Have you talked to him directly?" Alex asked. "Clear communication is key." "I have tried, but he deflects or promises to do better, then nothing changes." Alex sighed. "You need to set firm boundaries now before this becomes a long-term situation." That evening I sat Jason down for a direct conversation. "Look, I know this is a difficult time, but I need you to start actively looking for work. And while you are here, I need you to clean up after yourself and respect quiet hours." Jason rolled his eyes like a teenager. "You sound like Dad. Relax, bro. I am dealing with a lot right now. I understand that, but these are reasonable expectations. I am happy to help you, but I need to see effort on your part." "Fine," he muttered. "I will look at some job sites tomorrow." The following morning, I left early for a Saturday breakfast meeting with clients. When I returned 4 hours later, the house was empty, but the kitchen was a disaster. Empty beer bottles littered the counter, and a half-eaten pizza sat open on the coffee table. A quick check showed several of my craft beers missing from the refrigerator. Over the next 2 weeks, the pattern continued and worsened. I would find evidence that Jason had been inviting friends over while I was at work, unfamiliar water glasses in the sink, cigarette butts on the back patio, the furniture rearranged for what I assumed were gaming sessions. One evening I came home to find my collection of vinyl records out of their protective sleeves, several stacked haphazardly near the stereo. One of my most valuable albums, a signed first pressing from a concert I had attended years ago, had a visible scratch across its surface. "Did you have people over again today?" I asked when Jason emerged from his room. "Just a couple guys from my old job," he said casually. "We were catching up. Someone damaged my signed record," I said, showing him the scratch. He glanced at it dismissively. "That tiny mark? It probably plays fine. Besides, nobody listens to records anymore anyway." I took a deep breath, counting silently to 10. "That is not the point. These are my possessions, and they are important to me. I need you to ask before having people over, and I need them to respect my things." Whatever he muttered, grabbing his keys. "I am going out." That weekend, my parents called to check in. I tried to express my concerns about Jason's behavior, but they immediately became defensive. "He is going through a rough patch," my mother insisted. "You need to be more understanding." "I am trying to be understanding," I replied, "but he is not respecting my home or making any effort to find work." "Job hunting takes time in this economy," my father countered. "And Jason has always been a social person. You cannot expect him to sit alone in that room all day." By the end of the call, I felt as though I was the unreasonable one for expecting basic courtesy and effort from my 32-year-old brother. The conversation left me frustrated and doubting myself, exactly as similar conversations had throughout our childhood. Little did I know this was just the beginning of a situation that would eventually force me to choose between family expectations and my own well-being. As weeks turned into months, Jason showed no signs of leaving or securing employment. What had been presented as a temporary arrangement was beginning to feel permanent, and the impact on my daily life was significant. My utility bills had increased by nearly 40%, my grocery expenses had doubled, and my once peaceful home had become a source of constant stress. One morning in early April, approximately 6 weeks after Jason had moved in, I noticed he had used the last of my expensive coffee without mentioning it or offering to replace it. It was a small thing, but it represented the larger pattern of take and no give that had developed. I decided to try a different approach. "I found several job openings that might be good fits for you," I said that evening, showing Jason printouts from various job sites. "This warehouse position pays better than your last one, and this customer service role offers benefits from day one." Jason glanced at the papers and scoffed. "Warehouse work again? No thanks. And customer service is just getting yelled at by Karens all day. I am looking for something in management." "Management usually requires experience or education that you do not have yet," I pointed out as gently as possible. "These could be stepping stones." "I am not settling," he said firmly. I deserve better than minimum wage grunt work. This conversation repeated with variations over the next several days. Each suggestion I made was deemed beneath him, not worth his time, or somehow flawed. When I pointed out that having some income would be better than none, he accused me of not believing in him. "You have always thought you were better than me," he snapped during one particularly heated exchange. "Just because you got lucky with your tech job does not make you superior." "This is not about superiority," I replied, struggling to keep my voice even. "This is about you taking responsibility for your life." "You sound just like Dad when he gets on his high horse, Jason," retorted, walking away. By the 2-month mark, I was reaching my breaking point. Jason had transformed my guest room into what looked like a permanent living space with posters on the walls and his belongings spread throughout the house. He had established routines that centered around his comfort with no consideration for mine. My polite requests had escalated to firm demands which were either ignored or met with temporary compliance followed by reversion to the same behaviors. Then came the Sunday that changed everything. I was working in my garden, a weekend activity that helped me decompress, when my parents' car pulled into the driveway unexpectedly. They had not called to say they were coming, which was unusual. "We thought we would surprise you," my mother said brightly as they walked up the path. "Is Jason home?" "He is inside," I replied, removing my gardening gloves. "Probably still sleeping." My father frowned. At 2 in the afternoon. We went inside, and my mother immediately began fussing in the kitchen, unpacking containers of homemade food they had brought. My father settled into the living room and turned on the sports channel without asking. The familiar dynamic of my childhood home was now playing out in my own space, and I felt a surge of resentment. Jason eventually emerged, greeting our parents warmly. They did not comment on his late rising or disheveled appearance. Instead, my mother served the food she had brought, and we sat down to what appeared to be an impromptu family lunch. The conversation was pleasant until I mentioned that Jason and I had been discussing job opportunities. "Matthew thinks I should take any job even if it is beneath me," Jason said, rolling his eyes. I expected my parents to support my position, at least in principle. Instead, my father cleared his throat and said, "Well, son, finding the right fit is important. Jason should not jump at the first opportunity, if it is not right for him." "But it has been 2 months," I pointed out, "and he has not contributed anything to the household expenses." An uncomfortable silence fell over the table. My parents exchanged glances, and my mother reached over to pat my hand. "Matthew, dear, we need to talk about the living arrangement." "Yes, we do." I agreed, feeling a glimmer of hope that they were finally going to help establish some boundaries. "Your father and I have been thinking," she continued. "Since you have this big house all to yourself and Jason is family, it makes sense for him to stay with you until he gets back on his feet properly." I blinked, unsure I had heard correctly. "How long are we talking about?" My father shrugged. "As long as he needs. That is what family does. We support each other." "I have been supporting him," I said, my voice rising slightly, "for 2 months, with no end in sight. And we appreciate that," my mother said soothingly. "But Jason has always struggled more than you. Some people need more time to find their path." "I am 35 years old," Jason interjected. "I cannot just take any minimum wage job at this point in my life." I stared at him. "You are 32, not 35. And yes, sometimes adults have to take jobs they do not love to pay their bills." "The point is," my father cut in firmly, "Jason is staying here. And honestly, Matthew, we were hoping you might help him with his car insurance and phone bill too, just until he lands on his feet." The room seemed to tilt slightly as I processed what was happening. My parents had not come to help resolve the situation. They had come to formalize and expand my role as Jason's caretaker. The temporary arrangement they had promised was being revealed as the permanent situation I had feared. "Absolutely not," I said, standing up from the table. "I agreed to a few weeks of housing while he actively looked for work. I did not agree to indefinitely support a grown man who refuses to take responsibility for himself." "We raised you to value family above all, my mother," said her voice, taking on the wounded tone I recognized from childhood disagreements. "I cannot believe you would turn your back on your brother when he needs you." "I am not turning my back on him," I insisted. I am refusing to enable behavior that is ultimately harmful to him and unfair to me." "Harmful?" Jason scoffed. "Living in your precious house is harmful to me. Living without consequences or responsibility is harmful to anyone," I replied. The conversation devolved from there. My parents deployed every emotional manipulation tactic they had refined over decades: guilt about our upbringing, comparisons to cousins who supported their siblings, veiled threats about how family remembers who was there in times of need. Jason alternated between looking smugly, vindicated, and playing the victim, complete with comments about how I had always had things easier than him. By the time they left 3 hours later, I felt emotionally drained and conflicted. On one hand, the values I had been raised with emphasized family loyalty above all. On the other, my sense of fairness and respect for boundaries screamed that this situation was wrong. That night I barely slept. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of Jason playing video games down the hall well past midnight, and wondered how I had become trapped in this impossible situation. The next morning, bleary-eyed and exhausted, I made a careless error in an important piece of code that took hours to identify and fix. "You look terrible," my colleague Rachel commented during our lunch break. "Everything okay?" I found myself unloading the entire situation to her, something I rarely did with work associates. Rachel listened attentively, her expression growing increasingly concerned. "Matthew, this is not a family disagreement," she said when I finished. "This is exploitation. They are taking advantage of your success and good nature." "But they are my family," I said weakly. Rachel shook her head firmly. "Family supports each other reciprocally. This is one-way support with no boundaries. Have you considered getting legal advice? Because from what you have described, your brother has established tenancy in your home, which could complicate things if you do decide you want him out." Her words stayed with me throughout the day. That evening I researched tenant rights in my state and discovered Rachel was correct. In many cases, even without a formal lease, someone living in a residence for a certain period could claim tenant rights, making removal a complex legal process rather than a simple family decision. As I closed my laptop, I realized that what had begun as a favor was rapidly becoming a legally entangled situation that could impact my financial stability, mental health, and home ownership. Something needed to change, and soon. The situation reached its breaking point on a Wednesday in early May, nearly 3 months after Jason had moved in. I had been in back-to-back virtual meetings since 7 in the morning, dealing with a critical software issue that had our client in a panic. By 4:30 we had finally resolved the problem, and my boss suggested I take the rest of the day off to recover from the stress. I gratefully accepted, looking forward to a quiet evening at home. But as I pulled into my driveway, I noticed unfamiliar cars parked along the street. The sound of music and laughter drifted from my backyard. With a sinking feeling, I walked around the side of the house to find Jason hosting what appeared to be a party. 6 people I had never met were lounging on my patio furniture, drinking my beer and using my grill to cook what looked like steaks I had purchased for a special dinner I had planned for the weekend. "Matthew," Jason called out with false cheer when he spotted me. "You are home early. Come join us. These are some buddies from my old job." I stood frozen, taking in the scene. Cigarette butts littered my carefully maintained lawn. Someone had spilled what looked like red wine on the cushions of my outdoor sofa. 2 women were in my hot tub, which I rarely used due to the cost of heating it. "Can I talk to you inside?" I managed to say through clenched teeth. Jason rolled his eyes dramatically for his friend's benefit. "The homeowner needs a word," he announced. "Be right back, guys." Once inside, I was confronted with even more chaos. Dirty dishes filled the sink and spilled onto the counters. Empty bottles and food containers were scattered throughout the living room. And there on the mantel, where it had always held a place of honor, was my grandfather's antique pocket watch. Or rather, where it should have been. "Where is Grandpa's watch?" I demanded, my voice rising with panic. Jason shrugged. "No idea. Maybe you moved it." I never moved that watch. It had been my grandfather's prized possession, given to me when I graduated college, because, as he put it, Matthew understands the value of time. The watch was not just monetarily valuable, but irreplaceable in sentimental terms. A quick, frantic search revealed the watch on the bathroom counter submerged in a puddle of water from an overflowing sink. I carefully retrieved it, heart sinking at the visible damage to its delicate mechanism. Something inside me snapped. All the frustration, resentment, and suppressed anger of the past months crystallized into a cold, clear resolve. "Everyone needs to leave," I announced, walking back outside. "The party is over." "Come on, man," one of Jason's friends protested. "We just got the grill going." "I did not authorize this gathering, and you are all trespassing on private property," I stated firmly. "Leave now, or I will call the police." The group grumbled but began gathering their belongings. Jason stood with his arms crossed, face flushed with embarrassment and anger. "What is your problem?" he hissed once his friends had departed. "You completely humiliated me." "My problem," I echoed in disbelief. "You have taken over my home, contributed nothing, shown zero respect for my property, and now you have damaged a priceless family heirloom." "It was an accident," he muttered. "And this whole my home, my property thing is getting old. Mom and Dad said half this house should be mine anyway." I stared at him, momentarily speechless. "What are you talking about? I bought this house with my own money." Jason smirked. "They said family property should be shared. You are just being selfish, hoarding all this space for yourself when I have nowhere to go." The conversation that followed revealed a disturbing pattern. My parents had apparently been feeding Jason a narrative that my success somehow obligated me to support him. They had told him that my refusal to let him stay indefinitely was selfish and unbrotherly. No wonder he had shown such entitlement. He genuinely believed he had a right to my home and possessions. That evening I received an unexpected email from my neighbor Thomas. "Thought you should know," he wrote. "Your parents were at your house today around noon using a key to let themselves in. They were carrying boxes inside. I assumed you knew but wanted to check since you normally work at this time." Attached was a clip from Thomas's security camera, clearly showing my parents unloading what appeared to be more of Jason's belongings from their car and entering my house with a key I had not provided. A cold feeling washed over me. Not only were they enabling Jason's behavior, but they were actively working behind my back to establish him permanently in my home. The violation of trust was staggering. Further investigation revealed even more disturbing discoveries. Jason had been using my Amazon account to purchase items for himself. He had given my home address for several new credit card applications. He had even listed me as his emergency contact and financial guarantor on a job application, potentially making me liable for any problems that might arise. I sat in my home office late into the night, surrounded by evidence of how thoroughly my boundaries had been violated. The watch, now sitting in a bowl of rice in a desperate attempt to dry it out, seemed to symbolize everything that had gone wrong. My grandfather had trusted me with his precious possession, and I had failed to protect it because I had allowed myself to be manipulated into a situation that violated my own values. After 3 months of chaos, financial strain, and emotional manipulation, I made my decision. I would reclaim my home and my life, even if it meant confronting deeply held beliefs about family obligation. The next morning I called in sick to work for the first time in years and scheduled a consultation with Stephanie Miller, an attorney specializing in real estate and tenant law. Her office was in a converted Victorian house downtown, warm and professional, without being intimidating. "Based on what you have described," Stephanie said, "after listening to my situation, your brother could potentially claim tenant rights despite never having paid rent or signed a lease. In our state, establishing residence for more than 60 days can create an implied tenancy. So I cannot just ask him to leave," I asked, heart-sinking. "You can ask, but if he refuses, you would need to go through formal eviction procedures," she explained. "However, there are several factors working in your favor. You have documentation of the original agreement as temporary evidence of property damage and proof of unauthorized entry by your parents. We discussed various options from negotiated departure to formal eviction proceedings." Stephanie was direct but compassionate, acknowledging the emotional complexity of family disputes while providing clear legal guidance. "Many people feel guilty about setting boundaries with family," she noted, "but allowing someone to take advantage of you rarely helps them in the long run. Sometimes the most caring thing you can do is to stop enabling destructive patterns." Her words resonated deeply with me. For years, I had equated family loyalty with accepting mistreatment. Perhaps true loyalty meant wanting better for Jason than a life of dependency and entitlement. As I drove home, I felt a strange mix of anxiety and relief. The path ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in months, I felt I was moving in the right direction. I spent the rest of the day developing a strategic plan. I moved my most important documents and valuables to a safe deposit box at my bank. I transferred funds to a new account at a different bank. I documented the current state of my home, photographing damage and making inventory lists of missing or damaged items. I changed passwords on all my accounts and placed a fraud alert on my credit report. That evening I sat looking at old family photos, trying to reconcile the happy memories with the current reality. There we were at the lake house one summer, Jason and I building a sandcastle together. There was my graduation day, my parents beaming proudly. Had our family dynamic always been this dysfunctional, or had something fundamental changed? As I replaced the photo album on the shelf, my resolve strengthened. This was not about rejecting my family. It was about establishing healthy boundaries that would ultimately benefit everyone. With that realization, I finally felt ready to take action. The next morning, I requested emergency vacation days from work, explaining to my manager that I was dealing with a family situation requiring my immediate attention. Karen, always understanding, approved without hesitation, telling me to take whatever time I needed. My first task was securing my remaining valuables. I rented a small storage unit across town and methodically packed items of both financial and sentimental value. My collection of first-edition books, remaining family heirlooms, important documents, and irreplaceable mementos from my travels. It felt strange, almost like I was fleeing my own home, but Stephanie had warned me that eviction situations could sometimes turn volatile. Next, I visited my bank to complete the financial separation I had begun the previous day. I closed joint accounts I had naively established with my parents years ago for emergency purposes. I removed Jason as an authorized user on a rarely used credit card, a status I had granted during a previous attempt to help him build credit. I set up automatic payments for utilities from my new account to ensure no services would be interrupted during what might be a turbulent period. By afternoon, I was installing security cameras at key points around my property, the front door, back patio, and main living areas. I made no attempt to hide them, wanting Jason to be fully aware that his activities would be monitored. I also changed the locks, keeping the only copies of the new keys for myself. When Jason returned that evening and found himself unable to enter, he called me in a rage. "What the hell, Matthew? My key does not work." "I know," I replied, calmly opening the door. "We need to talk." His anger turned to confusion when he saw the security cameras. "What is all this? Are you spying on me now?" "Please sit down," I said, gesturing to the dining room table where I had prepared copies of documents, the original text messages establishing the temporary nature of our arrangement, photos of the damage to my property, evidence of unauthorized use of my accounts, and finally the formal eviction notice Stephanie had helped me prepare. "What is this?" Jason asked, picking up the notice. "I am giving you 30 days to find alternative housing." I stated, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "As outlined in this document, you have violated our agreement in multiple ways. I am no longer willing to provide housing or financial support." Jason's face flushed red. "You cannot kick me out. I live here now." "Actually, I can," I replied. "This is my property purchased with my money. Your tenancy was conditional on respecting my home and actively seeking employment, neither of which has happened. Mom and Dad will never allow this," he threatened, pulling out his phone. "They do not have the legal authority to determine who lives in my house," I said, remaining calm, "and I have already notified them of my decision." This was a bluff I would need to pay off shortly, but it had the desired effect. Jason hesitated, phone in hand. "Furthermore," I continued, "I have evidence that they entered my home without permission using a copied key. That is illegal entry, Jason." His expression shifted from anger to calculation. "Look, maybe things got a little out of hand. We can work something out." "The time for negotiation has passed," I said firmly. "You have 30 days to make arrangements. During that time, You will abide by house rules including no guests without prior approval, no use of my personal belongings, and quiet hours from 10 p.m. to 7 a.m. And if I refuse, he challenged, then I will pursue immediate legal eviction based on property damage and unauthorized entry, which could result in a court record that would make it difficult for you to rent elsewhere in the future. He stormed out, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows. Within minutes, my phone began ringing. My parents, as expected, were calling. I took a deep breath and answered. Matthew Wilson, how dare you treat your brother this way? My mother's voice was shrill with anger. After everything we have done for you, I am setting necessary boundaries, I replied. Jason has taken advantage of my hospitality for 3 months, with no indication of change. He is family, my father bellowed through the speaker. You do not turn your back on family. I am not turning my back on him, I corrected. I am refusing to enable behavior that is harmful to both him and me. What followed was perhaps the most difficult conversation of my life. My parents alternated between rage, emotional manipulation, and threats. They claimed I was heartless, ungrateful, and selfish. They threatened to disown me, to tell the extended family about my betrayal, even to come and physically remove the eviction notice. If you enter my property without permission again, I said calmly, when they made this threat, I will file a police report for trespassing. I have security footage of your unauthorized entry yesterday. There was a shocked silence on the other end of the line. You would call the police on your own parents, my mother finally whispered. I would protect my legal rights against anyone who violates them, I confirmed, including family. I do not even know who you are anymore, my father said, his voice heavy with disapproval. The son we raised would never turn his back on family like this. The son you raised, I replied, finding strength I did not know I possessed, believes in responsibility, respect, and reciprocity in relationships. Jason has demonstrated none of these, and frankly, neither have you in this situation. You will regret this, my mother warned. When you need your family someday, and we are not there for you, you will remember this moment. I already regret that it has come to this, I acknowledged. But I cannot continue to sacrifice my well-being for someone who shows no respect or gratitude. After they hung up, I sat in silence, emotionally drained but oddly at peace. For perhaps the first time in my adult life, I had stood firm against the tide of family expectation and obligation that had always threatened to drown my own needs and boundaries. That evening, my phone rang again. Expecting another angry call from my parents, I was surprised to see my sister Samantha's name on the screen. Samantha was 5 years older than me and had moved to California after college. Her contact with the family had become increasingly limited over the years, something I now began to understand more clearly. Mom called me in tears, she said without preamble. Apparently you are the villain in tonight's family drama. You could say that I agreed wearily. Good for you, Samantha said, surprising me. It is about time someone stood up to their manipulation. For the next hour, Samantha and I talked more openly than we ever had before. She shared her own experiences with our parents' enabling of Jason and their emotional manipulation when she had tried to establish boundaries. She had ultimately chosen geographic distance as her solution, but supported my more direct approach. They will make your life miserable for a while, she warned. But stand firm, this is long overdue, and maybe, just maybe, it will be the wake-up call Jason needs. Her support was unexpected and deeply meaningful. We promised to stay in better contact, and I hung up feeling less alone in what had become a family crisis. Over the next few days, the situation at home deteriorated as expected. Jason alternated between ignoring me completely and making passive-aggressive comments. He deliberately violated house rules, playing music loudly at night and leaving messes in common areas. My parents called multiple times daily, each conversation a variation on their initial outrage and disappointment. Through it all, I maintained my resolve, documenting every violation and consulting regularly with Stephanie about next steps. The security cameras proved invaluable, capturing evidence of Jason's deliberate provocations and deterring potentially more serious retaliatory actions. A week after serving the eviction notice, I returned home to find Jason in an unexpectedly conciliatory mood. I have been thinking, he said, looking uncharacteristically serious. Maybe we can work something out. I will start looking for a job more seriously, and I can pay some rent once I am employed. For a moment I felt a flicker of hope that he was finally taking responsibility. Then he continued. Mom and Dad said they could help with my rent for the first few months. They think $500 would be fair for the room, and of course I would need access to the rest of the house too. I realized this was not a genuine change of heart, but another attempt to establish permanency now with my parents' financial backing. The proposed amount was well below market value for a room in my neighborhood, and there was still no concrete plan for employment or independence. I appreciate the offer, I said carefully, but my decision stands. You need to find your own place within the time frame specified in the eviction notice. His facade of reasonableness instantly crumbled. You are going to regret this, he threatened. Mom and Dad are talking to a lawyer of their own. They say I have rights as a tenant that you cannot just ignore. They are correct that you have certain legal protections, I acknowledged, which is why I am following proper eviction procedures. But no judge will force me to house you indefinitely against my will, especially given the documented issues. As he stormed off, I realized the confrontation was far from over. In fact, it was about to move from the personal arena to the legal one. 2 weeks after serving Jason with the eviction notice, I received a certified letter from a law firm representing my parents and brother. The letter contested the eviction on multiple grounds, claiming that verbal agreements had established a more permanent living arrangement and that Jason had tenant rights that protected him from arbitrary eviction. I immediately forwarded the letter to Stephanie, who called me within the hour. This is not entirely unexpected, she said, but it does escalate the situation. They are requesting a hearing before a judge, which means we will need to present our case formally. What are our chances, I asked, stomach knotting with anxiety. Based on the evidence you have gathered, I believe we are in a strong position, she assured me. But court proceedings are never guaranteed. We should prepare thoroughly. Over the next week, Stephanie and I compiled a comprehensive documentation package, photographs of property damage, security footage, showing violations of house rules, text messages, establishing the temporary nature of the arrangement bank, statements showing the financial burden, and a detailed timeline of events. I also prepared a statement outlining my perspective on the situation, focusing on facts rather than emotions. Meanwhile, the atmosphere at home grew increasingly tense. Jason had essentially abandoned any pretense of looking for work or respecting house rules. He spent most days out of the house, returning late at night with friends who would stay until the early morning hours despite my objections. My parents continued their campaign of pressure through daily phone calls and messages, now interspersed with communications from their attorney. The court date was set for June 4th, almost exactly 3 months after Jason had moved in. As the day approached, I experienced a range of emotions, determination, anxiety, guilt, and a deep sadness that family relationships had deteriorated to this point. I took solace in regular conversations with Samantha and the steadfast support of friends like Alex and Rachel, who reminded me that I was taking necessary steps to reclaim my life. On the morning of the hearing, I dressed in my best suit and arrived at the courthouse 30 minutes early to meet with Stephanie. The waiting area outside the courtroom was sterile and tense, filled with people awaiting their own moments of legal reckoning. When my parents and Jason arrived with their attorney, a silver-haired man in an expensive-looking suit, they pointedly sat on the opposite side of the room. My mother appeared to have been crying, while my father wore an expression of stern disapproval. Jason looked uncharacteristically polished in borrowed or newly purchased formal attire. Remember, Stephanie murmured as we were called into the courtroom, stick to the facts and timeline we discussed. The judge will be looking for clear evidence, not emotional appeals. Judge Patricia Harmon was a no-nonsense woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a reputation for fairness. She reviewed the filed documents silently for several minutes before addressing the room. This appears to be a family dispute over residential occupancy, she noted. I will hear from both parties before making my determination. Mr. Wilson, as the property owner and complainant, you may present your case first. With Stephanie's guidance, I outlined the situation, the initial agreement for temporary housing, Jason's failure to seek employment, the damage to property, the unauthorized entry by my parents, and the escalating tension. I presented our evidence methodically, including photographs, security footage, and financial records. Your Honor, I concluded I have made reasonable efforts to help my brother during a difficult time, but the arrangement has become untenable due to his actions and my parents' interference. I am simply asking to regain full control of my own property. Judge Harmon nodded and turned to the opposition. Now I will hear from the respondents. My parents' attorney presented their side with practiced eloquence. He characterized me as cold and unfeeling, emphasizing family obligation and suggesting that I had verbally agreed to a long-term arrangement. He painted Jason as a victim of economic circumstances beyond his control, temporarily down on his luck but actively seeking employment. My mother testified next, her voice quavering with emotion. We raised our boys to believe that family takes care of family. Matthew has this big house all to himself, while his brother struggles. What kind of person turns their back on blood? My father followed with similar sentiments, portraying me as selfish and ungrateful. After everything we sacrificed to put him through college, this is how he repays us, by throwing his own brother out on the street. Jason's testimony portrayed him as actively job hunting, but facing rejection after rejection in a tough market. He claimed I had verbally agreed he could stay as long as needed, and that my sudden eviction notice had blindsided him. Throughout their testimony, I maintained a neutral expression, though, internally, I was stunned by the selective memory and outright falsehoods being presented as truth. Stephanie jotted notes rapidly, occasionally squeezing my arm reassuringly. When cross-examination began, Stephanie's experience and preparation became evident. She methodically addressed each claim with contradicting evidence, text messages, showing the explicitly temporary nature of the arrangement. Jason's social media posts, revealing outings with friends rather than job interviews on days he claimed to be job hunting. Bank records, showing consistent withdrawals at bars and entertainment venues, despite his claimed financial hardship. The turning point came when Stephanie called a surprise witness, my Aunt Margaret, my father's sister. I had not known she would be testifying, as Stephanie had made this arrangement, without telling me, to prevent any potential interference from my parents. Mrs. Campbell, what can you tell the court about similar situations with the respondent Jason Wilson? Stephanie asked. Aunt Margaret, always the straight shooter of the family, did not hold back. Jason lived with me and my husband for 8 months, in 2019, after another job loss. What started as a few weeks turned into months of the same behavior: no rent, no job hunting, damage to our property. When we finally insisted he leave, my brother Jason's father called us heartless and tried to convince other family members to pressure us into letting him stay. She went on to describe 2 other relatives who had experienced similar situations, with Jason establishing a clear pattern of behavior. The judge listened attentively, occasionally glancing at Jason, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Then came the most damning evidence. Stephanie presented text messages between my parents that Jason had apparently forwarded to me accidentally when trying to send them to a friend. In these messages, my father stated their plan clearly. Once Jason is established at Matthew's place, we can work on moving in too when we retire next year. That house has plenty of room for all of us, and Matthew makes more than enough to support everyone. He just needs to accept his family responsibilities. A shocked murmur ran through the courtroom. My parents looked stricken while Jason stared at the floor. I felt a cold wave of betrayal wash over me as the full extent of their manipulation became clear. This had never been about temporary help for Jason. It had been about establishing a multi-generational living arrangement at my expense, without my knowledge or consent. Judge Harmon called a brief recess, during which my parents and their attorney huddled in intense conversation. When court resumed, the judge addressed us all with a stern expression. Having reviewed the evidence and testimony presented, I find in favor of the complainant Matthew Wilson. The respondent Jason Wilson has no legal claim to continued occupancy of the property. Furthermore, the evidence suggests a troubling pattern of manipulation and boundary violations by all respondents. She turned specifically to my parents and Jason. The court orders Jason Wilson to vacate the premises within 48 hours. Any damage to property during this period will result in additional legal consequences. Furthermore, Robert and Linda Wilson are hereby prohibited from entering the property without the explicit written permission of the owner. Turning to me, Her expression softened slightly. Mr. Wilson, while the court recognizes your legal right to control access to your property, I would encourage all parties to seek family counseling to address the underlying issues that have led to this unfortunate situation. With a final bang of her gavel, the hearing was concluded. As we gathered our documents, I caught my mother's tearful gaze across the room. For a moment I saw not the manipulative parent of recent months, but the woman who had once bandaged my scraped knees and celebrated my achievements. The complexity of family relationships had never felt more apparent or more painful. Outside the courtroom, my parents and Jason hurried away without speaking to me. Stephanie placed a supportive hand on my shoulder. "You did the right thing," she assured me. "Sometimes the hardest boundaries to set are with the people we love most." As I drove home alone, victory felt hollow. I had won in legal terms, but the cost in family relationships seemed immeasurable. Yet beneath the sadness was a growing sense of liberation. For the first time in months, I would soon have my home, my privacy, and my autonomy restored. The path forward would be difficult, but at least it would be mine to determine. The 48 hours following the court decision were tense but orderly. As required by the judge, a sheriff's deputy supervised as Jason packed his belongings under the watchful eyes of my parents. I maintained a polite distance, interacting only when necessary to clarify which items belonged to whom. The security cameras remained active, documenting the process for any potential disputes later. My mother attempted several emotional appeals during the move-out, approaching me when the deputy was occupied elsewhere. "I hope you are happy now," she said, tears brimming. "You have torn this family apart." I resisted the urge to argue or defend myself. "I am sorry you see it that way," I replied quietly. "I still care about all of you, but I needed to establish boundaries." My father remained stoically silent, communicating only through curt nods and brief instructions to Jason. His disapproval radiated in waves, but the fight seemed to have gone out of him after the judge's ruling revealed their longer-term plans. Jason himself fluctuated between sullen silence and bursts of resentment. As he carried out the last of his boxes, he paused at the door. "You know you will need family someday," he said, "and we will remember this." "I hope what you remember," I replied, "is that respect and responsibility matter in any relationship, including family." When they finally drove away, the house felt eerily quiet. I walked through each room, slowly taking inventory of the space that was fully mine again. There was damage to repair, rearranging to do, and a lingering sense of violation to process. But underneath it all was relief so profound it felt almost like physical lightness. That first night alone, I ordered takeout, opened a bottle of wine I had been saving for a special occasion, and sat on my back patio watching the sunset. The silence was no longer oppressive, but peaceful. I slept better than I had in months, without the background anxiety of wondering what new boundary would be crossed the next day. The following weeks were devoted to reclaiming and repairing my space. I repainted rooms, replaced damaged items where possible, and rearranged furniture to erase the memory of unwelcome occupation. I found a watchmaker who specialized in antiques, who believed he could restore my grandfather's pocket watch, though the cost would be substantial. Some things I was learning could be repaired with enough care and expertise. Others would forever bear the marks of damage, but could still function and hold value. Work became a refuge rather than another source of stress. With my home situation resolved, my focus and productivity returned. Karen noticed the change immediately, commenting on how much more present and engaged I seemed in meetings. I gradually shared portions of the story with trusted colleagues, their support reinforcing my confidence in the difficult decisions I had made. Contact with my family ceased entirely for nearly 2 months. No calls, no messages, no emails. Samantha kept me updated occasionally, reporting that our parents were telling extended family a highly edited version of events that cast me as the villain. I chose not to contest this narrative, trusting that time would eventually reveal the truth to those who mattered. Then on a Tuesday evening in early August, my phone displayed a number I had not expected to see: Jason's. 23. After a moment's hesitation, I answered. "Matthew, it is Jason." His voice sounded different, less entitled, more subdued. "Hello, Jason," I replied neutrally. "How are you?" I got a job," he said. Assistant manager at Cartech. Been there 6 weeks now. Congratulations, I said, genuinely surprised. That is great news. There was an awkward pause before he continued. Look, I have been doing some thinking and talking to someone, a counselor. I wanted to say I am sorry for how things went down. I took advantage, and I was not fair to you. The apology was so unexpected that for a moment I could not respond. Thank you for saying that I finally managed. It means a lot. I am not asking to come back or anything, he clarified quickly. I have my own place now, a studio apartment. Small, but it is mine, you know. I am paying my own bills for the first time in, well, a long time. We talked for nearly an hour, the conversation gradually becoming less strained. Jason shared insights from his counseling sessions about dependency patterns and his fear of adult responsibility. I shared my perspective on how our parents' different treatment of us had affected our relationship as brothers. It was the most honest conversation we had ever had. Before hanging up, Jason asked tentatively, "Do you think we could grab coffee sometime? No pressure, just, I miss my brother." I would like that, I said, surprising myself with how much I meant it. 2 weeks later, we met at a neutral location, a coffee shop downtown. The conversation was sometimes awkward but fundamentally different from our interactions before. Jason spoke about his job with pride and shared his plans to take night classes toward a business certificate. I listened, cautiously optimistic about this new version of my brother, who seemed to be emerging from the ashes of our conflict. Rebuilding a relationship with my parents proved more challenging. Their sense of betrayal ran deep, compounded by the public revelation of their plans in court. My first attempt to reach out a card on their anniversary received no response. The second, a phone call to my father, resulted in a brief, formal conversation that felt like talking to a stranger. The breakthrough came unexpectedly at Thanksgiving, nearly 6 months after the court hearing. Samantha had returned from California and organized a family dinner at her hotel suite, neutral territory for all involved. My parents arrived looking older than I remembered, the strain of recent months evident in new lines on their faces. The initial hour was painfully polite, everyone carefully avoiding mention of the conflict that had divided us. Then, as we sat down to dinner, my mother suddenly put down her fork and looked directly at me. "I have been angry with you for a long time," she said, her voice wavering. "But seeing Jason now holding a steady job, living independently, I am beginning to wonder if you did him a favor after all." "It was never about hurting Jason," I said quietly. "It was about not enabling behaviors that were harmful to him and unfair to me." My father cleared his throat uncomfortably. "We may have been too protective of him over the years, and perhaps not fair to you in our expectations." It was not a full apology, but coming from my proud father, it was significant. The conversation that followed was difficult but necessary, addressing years of family dynamics that had contributed to the crisis. There were tears, raised voices at times, but also moments of genuine connection and understanding. As the months passed, our family relationship slowly rebuilt on new foundations. Jason continued his progress, maintaining his job, and eventually moving to a larger apartment. My parents gradually acknowledged their role in creating unhealthy patterns, though old habits occasionally resurfaced and required gentle but firm boundary reinforcement. The experience changed me profoundly. I became more discerning in all my relationships, recognizing that true love includes respect for boundaries and reciprocity of effort. I learned that saying no to exploitation is not selfish, but necessary for healthy connections. Perhaps most importantly, I discovered that standing up for myself did not mean losing my family, but rather creating the possibility for more authentic relationships. 1 year after the court hearing, my grandfather's watch returned from the specialist, restored to working condition, though still bearing subtle marks of its damage. It seemed a fitting metaphor for our family functional again, maybe even stronger in some ways, but forever marked by the experience we had endured together. Today, as I look back on that difficult chapter, I realize that what happened in court truly did end one story and begin another. The old dynamic of enablement and exploitation was replaced gradually and imperfectly with a new family paradigm based on mutual respect and appropriate boundaries. It was not the ending any of us would have chosen, but perhaps it was the one we all needed. Have you ever had to make a difficult decision that hurt in the short term, but proved beneficial in the long run? Or faced a situation where standing up for yourself meant risking important relationships? Share your experiences in the Portiefterite. Comments below. Sometimes the hardest choices lead to the most necessary growth. If you found value in my story, please like this video and subscribe to hear more stories about navigating complex family dynamics and personal boundaries. Thank you for listening, and remember that sometimes true family love means having the courage to say no when saying yes would harm everyone involved.